Okay, no, so we can start. In 1967, you wrote an article on the responsibility of the intellectual, a piece of work that really influenced my life. Not immediately. I was 12 years old when the article appeared, so it happened a bit later. In 2019, a conference in UCL in London, wishing to discuss this article about the responsibility of the intellectual, was censored, which shows that your article is still regarded as dangerous and subversive to the powers that be. It is indeed one of the many topics you were engaged with over the years, the responsibility of intellectuals. This continued censorship on your article, more than 50 years later, 53 years later, in fact, raises the question whether much has changed since. Is it possible that a new generation of intellectuals, of scholars maturing into the 21st century still shun that responsibility? And if I may add to this before you respond, Noam, and in this consent, to look beyond Britain to the USA and ask you whether anything has changed in your view in that part of the world, given the bleak view you used to have at the time and after 67 on the complicity of American intellectuals in the criminal American policies dating back to Southeast Asia in the early 1960s up to the present American involvement in the continued oppression of the Palestinians today. Has anything changed in Americans' intellectual sense of responsibility or even in their readiness to assume accountability for what is done overseas in their name, quite often with their intellectual support, and as citizens of America, also with their money in a way, as taxpayers? Are we in a better position today when it comes to the courage and commitment of intellectuals?
Well, let me start by just making a comment which few people know about the article you referred to, 1967. Actually, it appeared in 1966 in a place which would surprise you, the Journal of the Hillel Foundation at Harvard University. And that's a very significant fact. In 1966, I was giving a talk to the Hillel Foundation. They published it in their journal, Mosaic. Since 1967, that would have been impossible. And that explains some of the ways that things changed. In 1966, it was still possible to talk about Israel-Palestine in the United States. From 1967, it became virtually impossible. Anyone who tried to mention it was a pariah. You may recall a couple of years later, 1972, Abba Eban, who you all know, foreign minister at the time, very respected, had an article in the liberal Zionist journal, the Congress Weekly, American Jewish Congress. The article informed American Jews of what their responsibility was. Their responsibility was to show that there is no difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And anti-Zionism meant criticism of his government, the Labor government in Israel. And he gave two examples to show how dangerous this anti-Zionism was. He was talking about what he called Jewish self-hatred. And he gave two examples of Jewish self-hatred. I was one, Izzy Stone, I.F. Stone was the other. Dedicated Zionist, but critical of the government of Israel's policies. So he says, on the one hand, there are non-Jews who are anti-Semites. On the other hand, there are Jews who are consumed with a neurotic Jewish self-hatred. So that covers the spectrum. Anyone critical of the government of Israel is an anti-Semite. It's your duty to show it, Jewish community. You've recently heard that in England very prominently, same message. the way of destroying Jeremy Corbyn and a progressive Labour Party by showing that anyone critical of Israel is an anti-Semite. They don't put it in those words, but it's what it amounts to. Well, how much have things changed? Somewhat. So, for example, until a kind of a bellwether of American intellectual opinion is the New York Review of Books. It's the major journal of sort of left liberal American intellectuals. Up until maybe 2 or 3 years ago, this regime held. It was impossible to discuss the issue. I used to write for the New York Review regularly, but not after I became involved publicly in Israel-Palestine issues. After that, anathema, couldn't possibly. It has changed in the last year or two, strikingly. So if you read the journal now, you can read highly critical articles of Israeli policy, typically by Israeli writers. That makes it sort of tolerable. Strong article by Nathan Thrall, very, very strong article, appeared in a recent issue. All of this reflects changes in public opinion in the United States. And those ultimately reflect themselves in intellectual opinion and maybe someday in policy. That's a matter of some significance. But as Israeli policies became more and more brutal, reactionary, intolerable, what happened is that general liberal opinion, people who identify themselves as liberal Democrats, has shifted away from the almost Stalinist style support for Israel that used to exist, just reflexive, couldn't say a word. It's shifted to actually by now more support for Palestinian rights than for Israel. And it's showing up in the intellectual journals. It's showing up, not yet, but it may show up in policy. So support for Israel now in the United States used to be, Israel used to be the liberal darling. Couldn't say a word about it. It wasn't just not being able to write. Meetings were broken up. I had to have police protection if I tried to talk about the topic, even in my own university. That's all changed. Now it's quite possible in these circles to be very critical of Israel. Support for Israel has shifted to the evangelical community, a huge community in the United States, and to ultra-right nationalists, military and security committed, and so on and so forth. Now that does leave opportunities also for change in the policies. We haven't seen it yet, but this has a way in the press, not very much, but some. That's the way things change. That's how what's happened. Activism on the ground has a way of shifting attitudes, shifting what's sometimes called the Overton window, the range of things that you're permitted to talk about within the mainstream framework, where you can push a little at the edges. And this could, sooner or later, have an effect on policy if the proper activities are undertaken. So I think it's a very significant issue, not much discussed, but very worth looking at quite closely. Actually, my friend Norman Finkelstein has a book